I want to make the suggestion that doubt as a philosophy of life was first normalized and you could say publicized in the West by the Pyrrhonian skeptics. Now, the Pyrrhonians made doubt a lifestyle. They made it about as fashionable as a person can make it. You see, back in the 4th century BC, a young Macedonian named Alexander led his armies across Asia, defeating pretty much every nation in his wake, and establishing an empire unlike anything the world had known at that time. His campaign took him through parts of Europe, Africa, Asia, all the way to the borders of India. Now, in Alexander's army, there was a young soldier by the name of Pyrrho. And Pyrrho, like many young Greeks and Macedonians, was interested in philosophy. According to the accounts, and the history I realize gets a little blurry here, but according to the accounts, when Pyrrho arrived in India, he met a group of Indian philosophers known as the Naked Skeptics. The reason they were called the Naked Skeptics is because they were, well, naked. I mean, these guys were totally nude. And apparently they were skeptical about all kinds of things, including the use of clothing. It was weird, but for some reason, Pyrrho was intrigued enough to learn from these skeptics. And as the story goes, after his time in India, Pyrrho began to develop his own philosophy of doubt, in which the idea was to doubt everything, including doubting the idea of doubting everything. It was a form of radical skepticism that seems to have in some ways merged with Eastern non-dualistic philosophies that emphasized the search for inner peace through disconnection with the mind-external world. I suppose the idea was that through doubt we attain a sense of peace by expunging all the distractions and the stresses of the world around us. The Greeks called this a state of ataraxia, a lucid internal state of tranquility. In a similar way, the idea that ignorance is bliss or that what I don't know can't hurt me, this shows up in our culture today in the form of our contemporary Western obsession with Eastern pantheistic, non-dualistic philosophies, with their attempt to remove the desires and the cares and the inner troubles that result from the quest for knowledge. I get it. It's hard work to eschew false beliefs and to acquire true beliefs. It might seem that life is too short to worry about objective or absolute truth. Absolutes of any kind just seem to get us into trouble. It might feel like the world around us is illusory at times because the truths to which knowledge points are seemingly illusory. But if there's no purpose or teleos to the human desire for knowledge, we end up with an inadequate story about human nature. If our inquiry leads nowhere and our thirst to understand yields no fruit, then again we end up with an unsatisfactory story. In other words, I would argue that a life of skepticism about God, about the world, and about ourselves is inadequate. I would argue that we do in fact thirst for purpose, thirst for direction, for meaning. Now, how do we explain this thirst? Well, by the fact that there's a way to alleviate it. I think we explain it through the biblical narrative in which proper confidence in God and His world was given to humans by God. That confidence in God was broken by humans before God. That confidence in God can be restored to humans by God. You see, Pyrrho and the Naked Skeptics are only part of the story. Doubt has a long and inglorious history that's embedded in human nature and which dates back to the original Naked Skeptics, our first parents, Adam and Eve. Now, Genesis 3 tells us that Adam and Eve encountered a deceiver, right? The dragon, Satan, in the Garden of Eden. Satan promptly uttered those famous and devastating words, "Did God really say?" And in essence, he invited Eve to question God. But rather than trust God and doubt Satan, Eve directed her doubt toward God. Her thirst for knowledge was not wrong, but it was misdirected. Her doubt, her use of doubt was not wrong, but it was misdirected. She doubted the wrong thing. Now, the Bible tells us to doubt the right kinds of things, right? Doubt the devil, doubt the dragon, doubt the deceiver. John warns early Christians to not be deceived in 1 John 3:7. A little doubt will actually do you some good. When you hear something odd, question it. Test the spirits, it says in 1 John 4. Paul even warns the Colossian church, let no one take you captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies in Colossians 2:8. When someone shows up at your church with this entirely new way to understand the deeper meaning of the Bible that everyone else seems to have missed for the last 2,000 years, your hackles should go up. When someone shows up and tells you that God told them to tell you about some secret knowledge, your hackles should go up. When someone is so hung up on a tertiary issue in the Bible that they are distracted from the clear and essential matters of the gospel, your hackles should go up. You don't buy your prescription medications from the guy in the weird white van in the rough part of town, and you shouldn't get your gospel from the sketchy internet preacher. And yet, there's a time to step forward in belief. Remember Thomas in John chapter 20? I won't believe it until I see it. Now, you might say Thomas was just being careful. But in this case, Thomas was reprimanded by Jesus because he should have known better. Thomas, you've heard my teaching. You've seen my miracles. You've participated in my ministry. You've tasted the truth. You've heard me promise that I would suffer many things before being handed over to death and finally being raised to life. There's a point at which doubt simply becomes disobedience. Peter learned this lesson as well. Hadn't he seen Jesus walking on the water in plain sight in Matthew 14? Hadn't he himself taken several steps out on the waves? And yet his response was to doubt what had already been made clear. So as we go about the business of doubting and even guiding others in their doubt, there are a couple of things we need to consider. First, I would say doubting is not a sin, but it can get us into trouble. Doubt is part of the knowledge acquisition project, but it's not the final goal in and of itself. It's kind of like fire. See, fire cooks your food, it warms your home, it renews and purifies a forest, but it also burns your food, and it burns your skin, and it destroys your home, and it devastates the forest. So I would say handle doubt with caution. Second, doubt isn't a place to land. It's more of a holding pattern until we have either discarded a proposition we formally adopted, or until we've adopted the truth of a new proposition, or until we've allowed some new perception to generate new belief in us. So in essence, doubt might guide us toward a new way of viewing reality, but doubt doesn't produce anything in and of itself. See, when it comes to doubt, proceed with caution as you move toward the solid ground of faith.